I really believed that this never again is sufficient enough, and the responsibility which we inherited from Nazi Germany. Now, to make a long story short, when I started traveling to Bosnia, and I went in there the first time in June '93, sitting with the people in the basement and hearing the artillery over our heads, and them asking me, why, number one, don't you give us the possibility to protect ourselves? Because we had this arms embargo for regions where there was a crisis, German basic of politics, which not only the Green Party, but all the others have been sticking to. So they were denied the right to protect themselves. And then we said, okay, but we are sending you blue helmets. They are going to protect you. But they had a mandate which only went as far as them protecting themselves and not having the right to protect the civilians.
We talked about something that was called Perry's scheme, okay? It was about decision-making, personal decision-making, institutional decision-making, political decision-making. There were 9 positions on Perry's scheme. And the first position was like a child, right? Your id. You want what you want when you want it, and you don't really care about the ramifications. And it went all the way through to position 9, and position 9 was ostensibly the most mature position, or the position that the policymaker should take, and that was the recognition that in the face of ultimate uncertainty, decisions must be made. That you're going to have to act, that you need to act sometimes, even when you cannot adequately account in your planning, your speculation, whatever, what all of the downstream ramifications are going to be. As far as accountability is concerned, I think there were 3, these are very broad, somewhat vague, but I think they still make sense. 3 very broad areas that we should take into consideration, and that whatever we do as an international community, and we should do it together as an international community, we should try to maximize the impact on as many of these areas as possible and as deeply as possible. One area would be let's say the inherent or intrinsic value of justice. Of transitional justice as a value in and of itself. Number 2, you could say, would be the reparatory effect or impact that these mechanisms, or that the pursuit of transitional justice can lead to. And the 3rd is more political, and I think that would be the deterrent value of actions that are taken, both in terms of the deterrent value to the current conflict and the larger deterrent value, going forward in the future for the international community, for the global community as a whole. So if you think about decisions that we have to make, perhaps, and think in terms of some type of a loose matrix of those 3 areas, and is what we're talking about, is what we're deciding, maximizing impact across those 3, and not being a negative or a significant negative for any of those 3, that might be in some way a useful mechanism, intellectual mechanism, policy mechanism, decisional or deliberative mechanism to help determine policy.
I think that there are at least 2 elements, 2 instances where genocide is very, very clear. And the charges on that elements, I'm sure, shall be deemed as genocide. First is public incitement to genocide, in particular in Russian state-owned media, like RIA Novosti, with that publications, what Russia needs to do with Ukraine, the coming of the Russia and the new era, where there are explicit incitements to destroy Ukrainians as a nation. So public incitement, I'm sure, is there. So I think that prosecutorial authorities might work with this crime as a public incitement for genocide. And the other second element is the forced deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation. Because whenever we talk about Genocide Convention, whenever we talk about Article 6 of the Rome Statute or Article 444 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, one of the elements of the crime of genocide is forced deportation of children from one group to another. I do believe that these two instances are rather clear for us to move with this genocide qualification.
So, what's behind this idea to establish the Lemkin Center for collecting the and documenting the Russian crimes?
So we have 695 written testimonies right now. We conducted 80 sessions with interviewing people. We visited 58 locations to conduct those sessions. And the testimonies presented in those questionnaires cover 19 regions of Ukraine. We also have 386 video interviews. 307 of them were filmed in Ukraine. They are mostly being filmed in the freshly deoccupied territories as well as on the front line.
My key question for this presentation is what is the purpose of the Kremlin's war against Ukraine, of the Russia's, Putin's war against Ukraine, and starting from this historical comparison with the Soviet Union's attitude towards not just Ukrainians, my main initial thesis is that genocide in the Kremlin's eyes is a tool that can uphold the empire. Like yesterday, Professor Agnieszka Bińczyk-Misala has spoken about war crimes as a tool of conducting warfare, so I can expand this thesis to say that genocide is in the service of the empire committed by the Kremlin's regime. Comparing those two ideologies, so the Homo Sovieticus and Ruski Mir, in theory we can say that they are completely different because Homo Sovieticus was based on the communist ideology, so the value of internationalization and atheism, comparing to the Ruski Mir, which is based on the Russian nationalists and chauvinism, as well as the strong ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. So in theory, they are on the opposite ways of, let's say, perceiving ideology of the state. However, they both were and are totalitarian in terms of the internal repressions and imperial in terms of the imperial aims of the Russian Federation as it was in the time of the Soviet Union. And coming to my conclusion and also the last part of my today's speech, so comparison of those two historical and contemporary situation of the Kremlin's policy, we can look very briefly on the main thesis of Vladimir Putin's speech 3 years after the commencement of the full-scale invasion of 24th of February, when he told about this artificial forged Ukraine that only existed because of Vladimir Lenin, and called for denazification of Ukraine.
Let me tell you this, the transfer of children belonging to the Ukrainian national, or it doesn't matter, or Ukrainian ethnic group with a common language and culture from Tut to the Russian Federation with their subsequent adoption by Russian families, or education in the Russian educational system with all those lessons of patriotism, etc., recently implemented in the educational system. With such words that they want to change Ukrainians to Russians, they want to change their language, they want to change their history, their traditions, their culture. It is, this act is complete transformation of Ukrainians to Russians. And according to the representative of Venezuela during the drafting of the Genocide Convention, such forced transfer with this intent, when you change the customs, when the new language is obliged to them to speak, is in practice, it's tantamount to the destruction of the group of Ukrainians, because the future of Ukrainians depend on our children. And when you change Ukrainians to Russian, it is, of course, genocide.
The collection of evidence, as we could see and as we could learn, is, of course, not only the task to be carried out by the public prosecutors, but we've got several other initiatives. Again, we are indebted to Lemkin Center for organizing a platform, a very valuable platform for that. But it was not only the yesterday. I know it was late, but it was impossible to leave yesterday's session before this last part was put to an end. This is, of course, not the only initiative of that kind. Today, we've been able to learn more about other initiatives of that. Different INGOs, bar associations, would also be involved in doing so.
So I think that's very important. The quality and fairness of these trials will be guaranteed if the judges apply correctly the law and they know how to apply the law to the various situations, the war crimes with which they are dealing. And another aspect that is related to it is the notion of legal certainty. And I'm talking about the existence of a clear and foreseeable legislation on the war crimes. And that's something that we are lacking in Ukraine. During the previous panel, Oksana already mentions the blanket provision that we have in our criminal code that kind of criminalizes violations of laws and customs of war. So it's one provision that applies to all the different types of war crimes, be it killing of the civilian or indiscriminate shelling of civilian objects, or sexual violence or pillaging. All of these cases are prosecuted under the same provision. But the first point here is that actually not all of the violations of laws and customs of war amount to war crimes. Only serious violations of international humanitarian law constitute a war crime. So that's already the first obstacle for the proper application of law to the war crimes that the judges are facing. And the other point is that, of course, Ukrainian judges come from the continental law system, and they are very much used to using the definition of specific crimes that are spelled out in the Code of Criminal Procedure. And they don't have that tool when it comes to the prosecuting of the war crimes in Ukraine. So there is a need of reforming the legislation, providing kind of a list, definitions of the relevant war crimes so that investigators, prosecutors, and judges have this specific tool that tells them what kind of conduct amounts to the war crimes, what kind of elements they need to prove before anyone can be actually found guilty of the war crimes. So existence of this detailed legislation, this kind of updated and modern legislation is also, in my opinion, an important tool that would allow proper application of international humanitarian law and proper prosecution of the war crimes. There have been some attempts to pass such as legislation at the domestic level, but they haven't been successful yet.